Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Blair Wong, and I am the project specialist for Somerville's Digital Bridge Initiative. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the Digital Equity Planning meeting. We're excited to share with you all the work that our team and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council has done so far, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. I'm going to hand it over to MAPC shortly, but before we begin, I just wanted to review some basic housekeeping items. If you'd like to use the chat, you can use the chat function, but you can use it to either send the message to just the host and the panelists, or you can send it to all attendees. You'll just need to click the little drop-down button to select who you'd like to send it to. And then if you have any specific questions about the digital equity plan or what the presenters are talking about, you can use the Q&A function as well. And now I'm going to hand it over to the MAPC team.
Thanks, Blair. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Larrick. I'm the digital manager at MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We'll do more in-depth introductions in a moment, but I wanted to start with just an overview of our agenda for tonight. We're going to, after we do introductions, we're going to start with some level setting, some background on digital equity, and some background on our digital equity project, specifically the digital equity plan for Somerville. Then we're going to go into a bit more detail on what our work has entailed, what those methods have looked like, and kind of how we've done some research and collected data. Then finally, we'll share our preliminary findings and open it up for discussion and feedback from the audience as well. We want to make this interactive. So to kind of reduce those bullets into some clear goals, if you want to go to the next slide, Will, we're here to share some project updates on the digital equity planning process, as well as to hear your thoughts. We're here to listen as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, hello, my name is Stephen Larrick. I manage the digital team. We have a whole interdisciplinary team of folks at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council who are supporting the city of Somerville with the digital equity planning work. And joining me tonight are my colleagues Annika as well as Will. And my colleagues Alexa and Naji couldn't be here tonight, but they are from the data analysis team as well as the community engagement team. To give a quick introduction, I'll hand it over to Will and then to Annika from our team.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everybody. My name is Will Pfeffer. I'm the civic technologist on the digital services team here at MAPC, and I'll hand it over to Annika.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Annika Devanarayanan, and I am the digital equity planner at MAPC.
Thanks. And Annika's also been sort of the project lead on this work. Just to iterate and level set a little bit more, forgot to mention this, that Metropolitan Area Planning Council is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. So that means we are a public agency, but we perform planning consulting work, including being certified by the Mass Broadband Institute to provide digital equity planning support to cities and towns in our region. So Mass Broadband is the funder of all this work. We are a consultant on their behalf, helping cities and towns. Next slide, Will. And of course, we also want to introduce our colleagues from the Digital Bridge Initiative with the City of Somerville. So Blair.
Yeah, hi again. Again, my name is Blair Wong. I am the project specialist for the Digital Bridge Initiative. On our team, we also have Jennifer Mancia, who is the Senior Workforce Development Planner, and Luis Quispe, who is the Strategic Planning and Equity Manager. And I'll hand it back over.
All right, well, I'm excited to kind of start our conversation tonight with just a little bit of the basics of giving an introduction to digital equity and some of the premise behind our digital equity planning work with the City of Somerville. So starting off, for those who might be new to the conversation, what is digital equity? What are we talking about when we use that phrase? According to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, digital equity is a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. Digital equity is necessary for civic and cultural participation, employment, lifelong learning, and access to essential services. And I think another thing that kind of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance brings is that the digital divide, which you might have heard of, that's the issue. That's the problem we're all facing. Digital equity is our goal, and digital inclusion is the work of how we achieve digital equity. One kind of a bit of specifics that we can add to what is digital equity in your mind is we can think of digital equity as kind of having these three core components. They're sometimes called the three legs of the stool. That is broadband connection. So can you access the internet, a literal internet service? device access. So do you have a computer? Do you have a device that will allow you to take advantage of that internet connection? And then finally, digital literacy. Do you have the skills and the knowledge to take advantage of that device, to take advantage of that internet connection, to ultimately achieve the goals that you have, which is what really matters here. So moving on, just kind of with that awareness of that is our framework for digital equity and 3 legs of the stool, we also want to make sure that we're level setting with kind of the background of Somerville has done some great work ahead of the game here, also defining their own vision for digital inclusion and digital equity in Somerville. And so I want to just direct everyone to the Digital Bridge Initiative, and they have a great vision statement, including an equity statement and a statement of goals on their website, which maybe someone can share in the chat from our team. And I think just one thing I want to highlight is that Somerville, I think, has added to that National Digital Inclusion Alliance definition with something that I think it really matters and has been a guiding, a North Star for our work, which is that the Digital Bridge Initiative is prioritizing initiatives that address the needs of socially disadvantaged populations as the priority for this work. So we know that the digital divide does not impact everyone equally. And so that's been a real kind of first principle as we start this work. Moving on. So now we have a baseline concept of digital equity. What is a digital equity plan? Well, quite literally, there's a program funded by the Mass Broadband Institute to which the city of Somerville applied. And that program is to produce a strategic document defined to identify a community's needs, interests, and key assets, and provide a framework that will guide future municipal decision-making and potential investments and activities that will increase access and usage of the internet for the populations most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's kind of literally the definition by the funder and kind of also ties back to that funding source with the COVID-19 pandemic. But what does that literally mean? It means we're going through a process that will result in a document. That document will serve as a vision for the city of Somerville, as well as an assessment of existing conditions and needs in Somerville. And then finally, an action plan, kind of a strategic action plan for the city that will help guide future projects and resource allocation, et cetera. Next slide. And Somerville is not alone. So digital equity is something that communities across the country, especially spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic, have really picked up the mantle of. And so cities across the country are doing the work of digital equity, including doing digital equity planning. And here in Massachusetts, thanks to that MBI program that I've been mentioning, dozens in cities of towns are also doing the work of producing digital equity plans. To just give a little bit of an overview of MAPC's approach to the work, how we approach planning as a consultant. Our work is data-informed, but community-led, and I think you'll see that in the way that we're both taking advantage of existing quantitative data as well as incorporating qualitative feedback in our methods. We are doing this work not to create a plan that sits on a shelf, but to create something useful that will ideally help guide the city and help connect the city to resources, including grant resources. And then finally, as a public agency, we're kind of take a different approach than some private sector consultants. We are here as a peer agency to the city. We're bringing a multidisciplinary approach as well as a regional approach. We work with cities and towns across the region, and we try to bring that perspective to the work that we do in Somerville. Finally, to kind of ground this in the actual project, these are the 4 phases of work that we've been engaged with the Digital Bridge Initiative for most of this past year. So the work starts with an existing conditions analysis. My colleague Will is going to go a little bit deeper on what that means and what it entails, but basically getting a baseline understanding of digital equity conditions in Somerville by looking at the data and by reviewing the existing programs out there. Next, we really went deep on outreach and qualitative data collection through community engagement. So this is where we know that data is only going to get us so far, and we have to see the lived experiences of those both kind of providing services as well as those experiencing the digital divide most directly. And then kind of our current phase of work of bringing all that together to put together findings and recommendations and ultimately to publish a plan. So to go a little bit deeper on all of this, I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues, starting with Will, who's going to talk to you about that first phase of work.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so as we mentioned, we'll be talking about both the existing conditions analysis and the community needs assessment. We can sort of look at that as the quantitative phase and the qualitative phase. I'll be taking the first phase, and my colleague Annika will be jumping in on the second one there. So looking at our existing conditions analysis, there were sort of two major pieces of this. One was a review of existing work, both the previous work that the Internet Access Task Force had done and the report that they published, as well as moving on into the current work that the Digital Bridge Initiative is doing at the city right now. And then we also did a sort of a landscape analysis looking at digital equity assets, an ISP market review, and pulling in a variety of sort of standard data sources from administrative data sources and things that are kind of standard among digital equity plans and digital equity work around the country. Before we get into that analysis, I think I'll ask my colleague Blair to jump in here and talk a little bit about the previous work that has already been done in the city of Somerville.
Yeah, thank you, Will. So as some of you may already know, in 2019, the city convened the Internet Access Task Force. They met for a year and ultimately provided recommendations on how to expand internet access in Somerville. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic forced the city to refocus their efforts in other areas to meet the urgent needs of Somerville residents. At the same time, we also saw that the pandemic had a disparate impact on families who did not have reliable access to the internet. And also during the pandemic, various city departments and community-based organizations really stepped up to meet the needs of vulnerable communities who were faced with unaffordable internet, lack of devices, and a lack of digital skills. So in 2023, the city decided to create the Digital Bridge Initiative to bring all of those efforts together under one umbrella. The goal of the Digital Bridge Initiative is to help support practitioners in continuing the work of addressing the digital divide and to also streamline our efforts so we can better meet the needs of Somerville's most vulnerable residents. But our vision is to see the city of Somerville be one of the first US cities where everyone can use the internet with ease. We want to be a city that has invested in helping those who need it the most, which means that they can use the internet to chase their dreams, move up in life, and to stay healthy. So I will now hand it back to Will.
Great, thanks, Blair. So let's talk a little bit about internet service provider availability and sort of how we measure that, how we determine that. The Mass Broadband Institute has this great mapping tool. Maybe one of my colleagues can put the link there in the chat as well if folks want to click or copy it. This data is available statewide. There's a variety of different ways to look at it. If you are like us, you like playing around with mapping tools, so this is a good one to take a look at. But sort of jumping into where some of this data comes from and what it tells us, the sort of first source of data that we have about ISP availability is through the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. Any internet service provider that provides service to a fixed location, so this is anybody that is providing service other than satellite and cellular, has to report their service in a very specific way to using Form 477. That data is available publicly, and we use some of that in our analysis. What that data provides is it is self-reported by the ISPs, and it is it only reports, or they only report the fastest or the highest plan that they offer for sale in a particular location. And they have to report that they have to report the fastest plan that's available at least one address in each census block. In a dense city like Somerville, census blocks are pretty small. So this is a relatively geographically comprehensive data source here. They also need to report the number of broadband serviceable locations, or BSLs, at which each plan is available. A BSL is defined as an address, whether residential or commercial, that either currently has internet service or can be provided internet service within 10 days of a customer requesting it. And then they also have to report the technology used for each plan. So is it a fiber connection, a cable connection, or a fixed wireless connection? There's a bunch of things that this data does not include, so I think we need to be really clear about the limitations here. It doesn't include any cost information about any of the plans. It also doesn't include any of the lower tier plans, and it doesn't include any information about how many people have actually subscribed to the plans being reported. It only reports the existence of those plans available for sale. And then, as I said, satellite and cellular plan availability, that is also reported to the FCC. They report, service providers report coverage maps. That data is not included in this as one, because the data is reported a bit differently, and two, because it's not seen as much of a sort of reliable long-term solution to home internet connection. We also, and we'll talk a little bit more about the findings from that data analysis later this evening. We also looked at the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey, or ACS, is a survey that the U.S. Census Bureau conducts. It is reported as a 5-year rolling average. So each year, the 5-year bracket that's reporting sort of moves up by a year. So it's not up to the minute data, but it provides much more detailed data about people's daily lives than the decennial census does. That data includes some basic information about home broadband subscriptions, both how many people subscribe and what type of subscription they have. It also includes basic information on device ownership, how many people have devices, what type of devices they have. And then there's a pretty rudimentary breakdown of broadband subscription by household income. Again, this data has many limitations, some of which include there is that breakdown by income level. We don't have similar breakdowns by race, age, language spoken at home, or any of these other demographic characteristics. As I said, it's not up to the minute information. So the current ACS, the most recent ACS, I believe, is 2019 through 23, or maybe it's 18 through 22. But it is not like, absolutely current this year. It's a sort of rolling average. And then, unfortunately, the ACS, at least as of the most recent survey, doesn't ask any questions at all about digital literacy. And we find that that's sort of one of the hardest pieces of this puzzle to really get reliable quantitative data about. And then finally, on this part, before I ask Annika to jump in and talk about our community needs assessment, I'll mention asset mapping. So asset mapping thinks more about the resources that are available in the community rather than the experience of the individuals in the community. It is both a process of inventorying assets and actually literally mapping them, as you see on the screen here. We are looking at digital equity assets, which are things like libraries, schools, computer labs, device refurbishment centers, places like that a person can go and get access to something that can support their digital literacy needs, or digital equity needs, I should say. I'll mention here that this is done on sort of a regional scale. We know that a resident of Somerville is not limited to staying within Somerville's city bounds to access any of these resources. So we want to look at the resources that are available to folks who live in Somerville. This asset map will be published once it is finished and ready for that. It's not quite done yet, but it'll be published alongside the final plan. But for now, I will pass it over to my colleague Annika to talk through our community needs assessment.
Yes, thank you. So the community needs assessment is the second phase of the planning process, where we collected data ground up. We went and listened to what the residents had to say about their digital equity needs. And the way we did it was 3-pronged. We did municipal staff interviews, then we did surveys and focus groups to hear directly from the residents. And the outreach method specifically for surveys and focus groups were reaching them through the City of Somerville departments, through community-based organizations, through different language communities, social media platforms, and also attending any recurring events or meetings within the Somerville community. And in the next slide, I give a deeper dive into what the survey indicated us, and it was so this was a survey that was designed and administered by the Digital Bridge Initiative, and they collected 234 responses in total. And to give a breakdown of the race, ethnicity, and age, we heard from 42% of respondents who were Hispanic and Latino, and then 21% of the respondents were between the age 45 to 59 years of age. In addition to that, the survey was also administered in English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, traditional and simplified Chinese, Portuguese, and Nepali. And I want to highlight here that this survey complemented one additional survey, which was done by the Massachusetts Broadband Institute, whose primary role was to inform the statewide digital equity plan. But this survey by the DBI informs our community needs assessment and hones in on the needs and aspirations of most vulnerable population. And by vulnerable population, I mean people who are low income, senior residents, who are disabled residents, and non-English speakers. And we get further information on their needs additionally through our focus groups, which is highlighted in this slide of ours, where We conducted 6 focus groups from December to January, and these were 60 to 90-minute discussions directly with residents. And it was a mix of both online and in-person formats, where 3 focus groups were done online and 3 were done in person with residents from Housing Authority and in the food pantry. So through the focus groups, we talked to service providers, RSJ ambassadors, RSJ youth participants, then residents who use food pantry, and then specifically residents from Clarendon Hill Towers and the Somerville Housing Authority. And with that, and this is a high-level overview of what we heard specifically from the community outreach, and these are the kind of themes that we heard at more resounding concerns from the residents, which was on the ideas of reliability of internet access and the kind of support system that they seek and kind of language support that they want out of their digital literacy needs, as well as what kind of training types are they seeking. We dive deep into all these themes in our next few slides as we go through these findings. And with here, like I mentioned, these are our findings from both existing conditions analysis as well as the community needs assessment, and we are explaining them through 4 broad categories, the first being broadband access. And in Somerville, our data showed that Somerville residents have greater consumer choice compared to surrounding municipalities, and that the disproportionate impact that it has on specific focus group focuses our need on addressing more on the affordability and reliability issues of internet access. And then the second category is on affordability, where we've found that broadband affordability is a pressing need for Somerville residents, and that these affordability challenges impact these low-income residents, seniors, non-English speakers, more than it affects the other residents, which kind of compels them to resort to switching between services to redress those challenges. And then the third category that we talk about is device access, where we found that the current device access, whether it's through shared or publicly available devices, do not meet the entire needs that they have, as well as the vulnerable population also seek more additional technical and skills development in addition to just having devices that they can access. And lastly, on the idea of digital literacy and support, we found that these vulnerable population groups have higher digital literacy need because they are reliant on internet for public services, healthcare, and even basic skills to use the devices that they have access to. And then lastly, there is also a need for more systemic and formal support system, whether it's through digital navigator programs or IT support embedded within community organizations for them to confidently use all the digital tools. And this was a very high-level overview of our findings, and I will pass it to Will to dive deep into each of the sections that I gave an overview on.
Thanks, Annika. So speaking about broadband access, I think sort of one of the headline findings that we made here is that there is more consumer choice available in Somerville than in many surrounding municipalities in terms of internet service providers. I think there's a couple of caveats here to mention so that this finding isn't misunderstood. This is not a statement saying that there is adequate consumer choice in the market or that the services available are affordable. It is just a statement that there are more companies providing home internet service in Somerville than many of the surrounding municipalities. And even with that larger amount of choice, nearly a quarter of Somerville households have 2 or fewer providers available to them. There's also pretty limited fiber to home availability. There's only 1 provider offering service there, and that is to less than a third of broadband serviceable locations. And Comcast is sort of the biggest player in the marketplace. They serve effectively 100% of addresses in Somerville. I think our data shows 99.99% of addresses. They are using a fiber backbone, so they have fiber infrastructure in the city, but they're not offering fiber to the home service. So They are able to offer fairly high download speeds, at least at their costliest plans, but their upload speeds are pretty limited. Jumping a little bit deeper into this data, we can see this is the majority of providers available in Somerville. Astound or RCN, they are Astound is the current name of the cable provider. RCN are the only service provider that offers home fiber service, and they are offering it to less than 30% of addresses. Cable providers, both Comcast and Astound, offer fairly fast download speeds. They both offer pretty limited upload speeds. 35 megabits and 20 megabits respectively are probably adequate for sort of an average home use, but would not be enough to support any sort of higher demand or higher tech uses. There are also a couple of different fixed wireless providers. These are providers that are using like a terrestrial microwave technology to get service rather than fiber all the way to a home or cable all the way to a home. NetBlazer, Starry, and T-Mobile are offering services. There are a few other services that appear in the data that you'll see through the MBI map if you take a look at that. We've excluded the ones here that are either providing service to such a small percentage of addresses that they are sort of a rounding error, or services that are providing where their highest service is at or below 25 megabits over 3 megabits, because below that is not considered to be broadband by the FCC. Through the American Community Survey, we also get a little bit of a picture of broadband access. We see that about 93% of households have some form of internet access. Again, this doesn't tell us how fast their access is or how much they pay for it. And then 95.5% of households have one or more computing device. That could include a internet-connected smartphone, as well as a laptop, Chromebook, tablet, desktop, whatever, what have you. Where we start to see that 93.1% of households connected really start to break down is at the lower end of the income spectrum. These income bands are what are available to us through the American Community Survey, but we see that over 30% of households with a household income under $20,000 a year do not have an internet connection. 14% between $20,000 and $75,000 do not have a connection. And then over $75,000 annual household income, it's only 2.6% that lack a connection. As I said, these are the income bands available to us. I do wish that we had a little bit more granular data, especially in a higher cost of living area like Greater Boston. But this is the data that we have available, and I think this starts to really show us where the digital divide is being felt most acutely. We have some amount of geospatial data available from the ACS. It is available by census tract, so we can start to see where some of that disconnection lies. And these maps, I believe, will be published alongside the final plan if folks are interested in taking a deeper look at them. We've also done a little bit of comparison to neighboring comparison communities. So we see that the experience in Somerville is sort of a little bit more similar to that in Medford and Cambridge, and a little bit sort of more connected than Chelsea and Everett, but looking at some of these ACS data points in comparison to neighboring communities. And then we've also incorporated some speed test data. This speed test data comes from MLab, which if you type the word speed test into a Google search bar, the little built-in widget on Google is an MLab speed test. So that's where this data comes from. There are other speed tests available through different providers, but this is the one that we have used. And we see Somerville's average up and download speeds at about 220 megabits download and 27 megabits upload, which is I think sort of in the middle of the pack in terms of neighboring communities, as you can see on the Cora Bluff map here.
And a good kind of counterweight, I think, to that FCC 477 data. Right. So you can see that even the maximum speed is not as high as the self-reported maximum speed from the ISPs.
Yeah, nobody has taken an MLab speed test and actually experienced a gigabit connection. One minor caveat here is that I think most people who take a speed test do so if they are if their internet connection is not working in the way they expect. So I wouldn't expect to see a huge number of super fast internet connection or internet tests here, but this is one of many data points that we're bringing in. I'll turn it back over to Annika to talk through some of the qualitative aspects of the findings here on broadband access.
Yes, thank you. So with our community needs assessment data, we realized that we were filling some of the gaps that we were seeing in our quantitative data, and our findings showed that internet quality and reliability is a bigger issue than internet access or availability in Somerville. And we heard specifically from residents where they shared experiences of being frustrated or having challenges specifically with internet reliability, where we have a quote here from one of the housing authority resident where they share how having their internet cut off was giving them challenges for their educational performance of their kids. And then our survey results also show that 26% of Somerville residents who said that their internet cannot be reliably used by all members of their households when they need it. In the next slide, we highlight how it disparately impacts these vulnerable population groups. For example, this particular quote from a housing authority resident again highlights how, because the resident is blind, they have a higher degree of reliance on internet, and when the internet is unreliable or is in poor quality, they are cut off from further other services or further other opportunities for them to be connected with the entire community. And with the second point, we also found that with post-pandemic, a lot of the meetings, in-person activities moving online into these digital spaces, there is also an additional support that these vulnerable population groups seek when they want, if they want to be engaged or included in these digital spaces. And lastly, on broadband access, specifically from our focus groups, we heard that many residents were favorable to the hotspot services that they were getting. And this was specifically to residents who had no access to internet at all. So our finding acknowledges the fact that even though hotspot is not a long-term solution for us, it is a short-term solution that meets the immediate needs of the residents. And with that, we'll move to the next section on affordability, and I'll pass it to Will.
Thanks. So as we mentioned, broadband affordability is a concern in Somerville. I think we already went over this data point here that more than 30% of the lowest income households in Somerville are disconnected, and a fairly small number of households earning $75,000 a year or more are disconnected. One really key support, or one key resource that folks have been relying on up to this point has been the Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP. ACP is a federal subsidy program that offers income qualified households a $30 per month subsidy towards their internet bill. Unfortunately, the Congress appropriated a finite amount of money for ACP, and that money has essentially run out. So the FCC announced just recently that they are stopping accepting new enrollments, and in fact, they stopped accepting new applications for ACP subsidies about 2 weeks ago. And that program is expected to entirely run out of money sometime in April. So in Somerville, based on the most recent data that we have, which is, I think, as of January, so I don't expect that it's changed very much, there were about 2,200 households enrolled in the ACP subsidy program in the city. And those folks will lose access to that subsidy that they're getting currently. To sort of put a little bit of scale to that, the amount of subsidy the combined amount of subsidy that those folks will be losing is over $65,000 a month that those lowest income households will need to find elsewhere in their household budget, or make the choice that they aren't able to afford to stay connected to the internet. So that is one vulnerable community that had access to a support that is actively losing that support. And then finally,
one more thing on that ACP point, Will, before we move on, is we also know that 2,200 figure is an underestimate of those in need. in part because when we look at the ACS data on enrollment in that program compared to the eligible households for that program, we see, what was it, something like 20% of those eligible are actually enrolled. And so
I think it was closer to 10. It was quite low.
Quite low. So this really is an acute need. And in some ways, those that were actually enrolled in ACP are just the tip of the iceberg of what the need actually is in Somerville.
Yeah, thanks for adding that context, Stephen. And then finally, from some of the survey results for the survey that the Digital Bridge Initiative conducted, 52%, so more than half of the respondents to that survey reported that it was either somewhat hard or very hard to pay their internet bill every month. So I think that this continues to highlight the affordability issues for a broadband connection. I'll pass it back over to you, Annika, to continue to talk about this from a qualitative perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And our focus group data kind of echoed what our quantitative data and survey results were showing, which is basically that internet service affordability is indeed a pressing and widespread issue in Somerville. And our quote here particularly shows that there are certain populations, specifically seniors and non-English speakers, who face additional challenges because they aren't able to go and talk to the ISP service providers to resolve their affordability issues, either because they face mobility challenges or they can't speak in their own native languages. But in addition to internet service affordability, our focus group data also highlighted affordability challenges with regard to devices. And this again focuses on the senior population. And through our quote here, you can find that they face device affordability challenges primarily because they are unaware of any essential upgrades to keep their devices functioning and maintain them in their affordable range. With that, our third category that we discuss our findings is on the idea of device access. And here our geospatial data shows that 3.6% of households have smartphones and no other devices. And in the next map, we see that 5.5% of households have no computer devices to meet their device access needs. And in the next slide, I talk about the survey results, which show that 80% of the Somerville residents use smartphones primarily to meet their device needs. And the graph here kind of highlights that device access needs for vulnerable population is primarily through smartphones. Even though they have access to Chromebook, laptop, and tablet, they are more susceptible to rely on smartphones. And then in our next slide, we talk about our focus groups findings, where we found that device access needs, whether it is through publicly available devices or devices through community resources, does not meet the actual needs that they have. And we have some quotes again from our focus groups here, where housing authority residents shared that even though there are 10 devices within the housing authority, there are 100 residents who need to use it and it does not meet their needs. But another theme that came out of our focus groups is also the idea that just giving them access to devices is not helpful. They also seek more technical support and skills development in order to efficiently use the devices that you give them access to. And lastly, when it comes to senior population and disabled residents, they need more tailored support that will help them more freely and efficiently use the devices that they have. For example, in our focus groups, we heard senior population say that because of their limited eyesight, they are not able to use the keyboard in the right way, or because of their arthritis issue, again, they can't use all the devices in the way it is meant to be. And with that, we move to our last theme on our findings, which is on the idea of digital literacy and support. Again, here, the vulnerable population shared highest digital literacy need, and we measured this by the idea that they are susceptible to high pricing, they're susceptible to more misinformation, the kind of support that they currently get is not aligned with their needs, and the idea that they have lack of access to devices. So all these form a precondition for them to even access the digital literacy tools that can be made available to them. In addition to that, they also face challenges, more geographic or mobility challenges in terms of transportation barriers and even logistic barriers in terms of childcare needs that kind of hinders their ability to access these digital literacy tools. For example, we heard one non-English speaking resident in one of the housing authority share how she was able to use the digital literacy classes, but once she advanced in the classes, she was asked to move to another location, and because of the transportation needs, she couldn't continue with her classes. And lastly, we also heard resounding concerns on privacy and security issues when it comes to more digital literacy support. So we had, again, a non-English speaking resident share how their concerns of security because they felt their community was being targeted with scams and phishing emails that were putting their identity into safety, identity into concern. And then lastly, this is our data point from the survey where supports the idea of internet safety concerns, where 63% of survey respondents reported being somewhat or very concerned about internet safety. And of that, 35% of the respondents also were interested in free computer classes that will help them learn ways to keep their information safe. And in terms of digital literacy, we have another data point from the survey in our next slide, where we found that 66% of survey respondents were interested in taking computer classes, which were free, and they wanted to, and this graph kind of shows what they would use those classes for, where they said they want to use it for education, work, to apply for more job opportunities and access more telehealth and essential services. And on the last bit from our focus groups, which is on the idea of support that these residents seek, we found that the residents tend to rely on more immediate and informal support, whether it's from their family or friend, to resolve their technical issues. And then specifically for non-English speaking residents, they also rely on auto translate or Google Translate, which we've heard from focus groups does not always meet their needs and is not 100% accurate when it comes to being able to engage online in their native language. And lastly, we also heard that a lot of the support that these residents are seeking in Somerville are already present in the community, whether through programs through the city or through the community-based organization, but there is a lack of education or awareness about these existing support systems. And with that, we've wrapped up our findings from our planning process, and I'll pass it on to Stephen again to moderate the next bit.
Thanks, Annika, and being mindful of time here, I do want to make sure that we have some time to open this up for discussion. So I'll try to breeze through these slides. So our next steps, we are still finishing up a little bit of analysis of provider-owned fiber infrastructure maps. So these have been obtained through a request from the city through something called a cable franchise agreement, through which the city is able to access this proprietary information about the location of fiber infrastructure. We'll bring that in alongside all of the kind of data that you saw shared today to develop an action plan with long-term and near-term recommendations. And then we'll compile all that together into a draft and then eventually published full digital equity plan document that, again, we hope will not just be a plan on a shelf, but an actual useful tool for Somerville to kind of move these projects to implementation as well as just vision.
Some of the opportunities that were that are upcoming or current for the city in terms of digital equity. MAPC also has an apartment Wi-Fi program where we're working with the Mass Broadband Institute to provide procurement support and funding for housing authorities and affordable housing sites to provide their residents with free access to Wi-Fi. We're in the very early stages right now of a project with Somerville Housing Authority to provide Wi-Fi access to residents at the Mystic View and Mystic River sites. MBI is also launching a residential retrofit program, which will provide capital funding to excuse me, to update in-building wiring at MDUs or multi-dwelling unit buildings, primarily also affordable and public housing. This will ideally, this will hopefully support or address some of those reliability issues. MBI has also made available implementation funds to municipalities which have done digital equity plans to provide some more flexible funding to be able to implement some of the recommendations identified during the planning process. And then there's additional funding coming from the federal government through the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD, which will support digital equity statewide. And then our team, and in particular Annika, has done quite a bit of work to identify additional state, federal, and charitable funding that can be used to support a variety of different implementation activities that are discussed in this plan. With that, Stephen, I'll pass it over to you to lead us into discussion.
Great. Yeah, and I see we have one question in the chat, and I do think we have a small enough group here that Blair, if it's possible, we can let folks maybe share their screens if they're willing, if they want to add anything to their written questions or comments. But yeah, we want to open it up for discussion and questions. So this is completely open to anything that folks want to say, ask, or share. But to kind of start us off, we provided a little bit of prompts here. So any questions on the project, on the planning process, on the methods, and what we've done so far? Any reactions or kind of thoughts about the findings that we presented? Really curious what digital equity issues might resonate the most for you, your family, or those you know. And kind of anything that you see as the biggest digital equity challenges affecting specifically vulnerable communities in Somerville. And then finally, as we move from compiling all this data and thinking about just the findings, what we've observed, what we've seen, to thinking normatively, not just descriptively, about what we want to recommend, we are curious to hear your thoughts. What are your ideas about opportunities or projects or other things that the city could do to help those most in need and most impacted by the digital divide? So with that, I see we have a note from Greg Hill that he has a couple of comments. Greg, would you like to type those comments out, or you're interested in are you camera ready, so to speak? And Blair or Will, are we able to make?
Yeah, I can. I'll allow Greg to talk here. Greg, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of comments. I'm a member of the Somerville Internet Volunteers Committee, which is a combination of the Broadband Committee and former members of the Somerville Internet Task Force. I note that you mentioned the recommendations of the Somerville Internet Task Force, which was issued in 2019. However, there has never been a public hearing so that the public about the recommendations of the Internet Task Force, so that the public can chime in a forum where they can be heard to discuss those. Also, I'm a senior on a fixed income. I don't believe I'm also a member of the Somerville Stands Together, which is a labor community coalition that's been around for a few years. We have sponsored a couple of forums over the past few years about municipal broadband. Our labor coalition group has never received any outreach from your Digital Bridge initiative. In line with having a public hearing on the findings, the recommendations of the Internet Task Force, there should be within that public hearing a discussion about municipal broadband, because the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has identified over 900 successful municipal broadband systems around the country. That needs to be seriously looked at. And I hope that that can be those issues can be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I don't know if anyone from the city wants to speak to any of Greg's comments. I'll just mention we're certainly very familiar with municipal broadband and with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Actually attended some of their sessions at the National Digital Equity Summit this past week in Philadelphia. But want to turn it over to the city in case there are any comments on Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for your comments. I'm actually going to hand it over to Luis, who can kind of speak to your concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. So with regard to the discussion on the forum, it's apologies first of all if we missed your group. I'm curious if you're as a representative of that group in this forum that we're in now, where we have this
Yes, sir, I am a representative of that group.
Sure. Yeah. If we're able to, if you're able to provide any feedback on these talking points that we have on the screen here to be able to collect that. Apologies if we weren't able to reach you through our community engagement process already, but yeah, if we have you here now, we'd be happy to hear.
Well, I could provide some talking points, but probably not during this session, but I would love to provide some in a follow-up.
Sure. Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. And if you can share your contact information in a chat to the host and panelists, that'll make sure we have your information to follow up.
Well, you have my email address, and I can get back to you shortly.
Perfect. Thanks. I see also we had a comment from Anne about just questions about what's going on with the ACP program. I think that's on a lot of our minds right now. Will, do you want to just kind of read in for the record and for anyone who's not paying attention to the chat, just that back and forth?
Yeah, and I think Anne's question had only gone to us, so other folks who were in attendance may not have seen it. Anne had asked who is spearheading the continuation of the internet subsidy or the ACP program, whether that's the FCC, and if Representative Presley had been contacted. I know Senator Markey had a press conference on this earlier today, just this afternoon. There are quite a few groups in Massachusetts that have been pretty heavily involved in advocating for Congress to continue the funding here. I am sure that the FCC themselves are also working with their partners in Congress. Essentially, what needs to happen for the subsidy to continue is for Congress to authorize additional budget for it. Yeah, I think that advocacy work is pretty active right now. And our partners at the Mass Broadband Institute have been very heavily involved in that advocacy as well. I will say, I know writing to your members of Congress, both of our senators and Representative Presley, the more they hear from constituents that this is a priority for their constituents, the more resources they can put behind advocating for it.
All right, we are at the end of the hour here, but want to make sure that anyone who, we've got a raised hand from Anne. We able to?
Yes, Anne, you should be able to unmute if you'd like to.
Thank you. This has been very interesting, and I'm extremely interested in cybersecurity, and I'm also interested in how, for example, MAPC manages its own cyber operations. Just like I'm interested in how Somerville manages its own cyber operations and to the networks to which it belongs and platforms. That's a cybersecurity question. And it's often considered to be not a conversation topic. And if we are to understand how we are to be secure, it would be very helpful to address how currently you are managing your own cyber operations and the problems you encounter as part of digital equity. Am I making sense to you at all?
Yes.
Yeah,
Stephen,
thank you
do
for
wanna
that
speak to that a
perspective.
bit, or?
What?
Sorry, I'm happy to respond to that as a starting point. And I'm curious, how do you see cybersecurity as related to digital equity and to kind of
Oh.
ensure folks who need to access the internet? I mean, I think certainly some of our focus group feedback was on how certain communities feel, intimidated in some ways by the internet and by some of
Certainly, yes.
the kind of forces out there.
Yeah,
That has been a barrier to access. So I'm curious, what are your
certainly. Well, there are also there are mobile services that are so badly run that they create vulnerabilities for the user. Number one, you have to pay attention to who your mobile provider is, just like it's a good idea to pay attention to your device. Those are financial issues right there. And badly run mobile systems are a huge cyber vulnerability. So I'm really interested in the oversight that these two entities, Somerville and MAPC, are giving to their own systems and the problems they encounter, because all of that costs money. And that's part of the equity issue. Because I happen to have encountered something with MAPC was I tried to sign up for an event, and I kept getting a message that the link to sign up was not secure. And I said it to MAPC and said, "What are you doing about this?" And I heard back that somebody was trying to do something. But that's your oversight problem. It's a security problem, and it's a financial problem, and it's part of equity.
Sure.
In my mind.
Thank you for those comments, Anne. Yeah, apologies that we don't have someone from our IT team to speak to whatever our specific infrastructure looks like, but I appreciate your comments.
Okay.
Anyone from Somerville want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I can chime in on that. So early on, we were looking into what the scope of work would be for the digital bridge initiative, and we found that the most effective use of our resources at present would be in making sure that we had the three pillars or the three legs of the stool, as we mentioned, of digital inclusion work be our focus. And we felt that broadening the scope to include our internal infrastructure, or like our IT infrastructure, would not be something that we would be able to do with the resources that we had. And there's not to say that we're not prioritizing those.
Right.
We do have an IT office as well that is working on boosting and bolstering our internet technology infrastructure across the nation. IT security is an issue in municipalities across the board. So we're working on both fronts as much as we can with the resources that we have. But for the Digital Bridge Initiative, our focus is primarily on digital inclusion work, which is to say the services that we're providing externally to clients to be able to get them to bridge that gap. And not we're working
Are you looking at the services to be sure they're good? Because there are some really appallingly bad, cheap mobile services, and I'm sure that's also true for internet as well. And those are big problems in people's lives. And that's to the extent that if you buy a cheap product, you have no guarantee of service whatsoever.
To the extent we're talking about the quality of connections, yes. To the extent that we can influence the
Yeah.
private sector security methods, we have to look at that through what we can influence through the municipal side of that.
Yep.
A lot of
Yep.
internet servicing is regulated by the federal, was it FCC? So it's a lot of it is out of our hands in that sense, and that would have to be something that is more coordinated through our intermediary delegates, such as the state and
Yeah.
representatives.
The elderly are particularly vulnerable to this because there are a lot of elder phone scams out there. And,
Yeah.
you know, it leads to, it doesn't enhance equity is what I'm trying to say. There's a real need for oversight and expression of caution as part of digital literacy and as part of equity.
Yeah, I think some of the findings that we've had through our community engagement process have really echoed that folks want to make sure they have the knowledge and the digital skills to keep themselves safe online.
Yeah.
And I think, both the work and the recommendations that address digital literacy to help people know how to keep themselves safe online, and then to address affordability so that people don't have to rely on the lowest cost and lowest quality devices and connections are both things that that are very important to this planning team to make sure that are addressed.
And if you develop contacts with, I mean, I forget now because I got out of it. I once had a cheap elder phone and I got rid of it. And I'm willing to budget for what I have, which doesn't mean that it's great, but it's a little more secure. If you know or include how to influence programs that are out of your direct orbit, but have influence on the population you're trying to help, that's always a good thing. Because knowing where to report really bad service is very hard to find. And that's part of what I'm trying to talk about in cybersecurity and affordability, is the ability to contact and report responsible entities.
I think that's a great point. One of the things that we've heard is just that help with, whether it's with a digital navigator, a liaison, an ombudsman, someone who can help folks navigate sometimes complex bureaucratic processes, whether it's talking to an ISP on the phone through their customer support line. And I think this idea of where do folks go to report issues, if there is such, we'll have to do more research, but if there is such a kind of reporting process, to that point of there's sometimes resources available, but folks don't know where to find them. And maybe we need something like a directory. So these are all ideas that we're kind of working through as we come up with our recommendations or an action plan.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that idea of consumer protection as a really important part of digital literacy is your point is well taken on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Yep. It was a very interesting presentation. And I'm glad MAPC is involved in this.
Great to hear that. All right, we are past the hour here. Oh, Will, did you have something to add?
I was just gonna, maybe I'll just voice Alex's comment in the chat here before we close, just to make sure that other folks can hear it. Alex just comments that it can be very unnerving to members of immigrant communities to be queried as to location, as Google does, for example. This is out of our direct control, but is an educational issue. I think this is also a really important point that, technology asks us for a lot in terms of the data that we are willing to share, and it's not always clear why we're being asked and how that data is being used. And yeah, folks in vulnerable communities are vulnerable to that kind of data tracking, and I think that's a really integral part of making sure folks know how to stay safe online and know how to share the information they are comfortable sharing and not have to share the information that they're not comfortable sharing.
Great. Any final thoughts or questions before we wrap?
You put the DBI's contact information up on the screen here as we close.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the Digital Bridge Initiative for being such good partners, and I think for really taking the work of really leading with equity when it comes to digital equity in this work. And looking forward to kind of taking the next steps to actually putting out an action plan and a plan document for the community. Thanks everyone for joining. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.